I didn't want to be there. That's the first thing I need you to understand. The reunion wasn't something I chose. It was something I agreed to, the way you agree to most things after a certain age. Hannah thought it would be good for me. She said I'd been distant lately, that maybe seeing old faces would remind me of who I used to be. I didn't tell her that was exactly what I was afraid of. The bar was dim and too warm, filled with people I barely recognized trying to pretend we all still mattered to each other. I shook hands. I laughed at jokes I didn't find funny. I answered the same questions over and over. Yes, 2 kids. Yes, still in the city. Yes, life's been good. The lies came easily. They always do when you've been practicing them long enough. By the time I stepped outside, the air felt like mercy. It was late autumn, the kind of night where your breath becomes visible and you can feel winter waiting just beyond the edge of things. I stood under the awning with my coat collar turned up, watching strangers pass by in pairs and groups, their laughter rising in clouds that disappeared into the dark. I was waiting for a ride. I was waiting to go home. I was waiting for the night to be over. And then I saw him, Elias Ward, standing near the curb with his hands in his pockets, looking exactly the way I remembered and nothing like him at all. He was older. We both were. But there was something about the way he stood, that same unguarded stillness, that made my chest tighten before I could stop it. He saw me at the same moment. His face didn't change much, just a small lift at the corner of his mouth, like he'd been expecting me. He said my name. Not a question, just a fact. I said his back. We stood there for a moment, the noise of the bar muffled behind us, the cold pressing in from all sides. I don't know what I expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. He asked if I needed a ride. I told him I'd already called one. He said he had 2. Then he smiled, faint, careful, and said we could share it if I wanted. Save some money. Make it easier. I should have said no. I got in the car. The back seat was narrow and dark, the kind of space that makes you too aware of your own body. Elias sat beside me, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of his cologne, something woody and clean. We didn't talk much. The driver had the radio on low, some station playing songs I didn't recognize. The city slid past the windows in streaks of light. Neon signs, headlights, the glow of apartments where other people were living other lives. I kept my hands in my lap. I kept my eyes forward. I tried to pretend this was nothing. But then we pulled up outside my house, and Elias reached into his jacket for his wallet. He pulled out a few bills, more than his share, and when he leaned over to hand them to me, his fingers brushed mine. It wasn't an accident. I knew that immediately. He pressed the money into my palm, but he didn't let go. His thumb moved, just slightly, against the inside of my wrist. It was so small, so deliberate. It said everything we hadn't been able to say for 20 years. I looked at him. His face was close, his expression unreadable in the shadows. The porch light from my house spilled through the window, and I could see Hannah's silhouette in the glass, waiting the way she always did. The driver coughed, cleared his throat. Elias said goodnight. His voice was soft. His hand was still there. I didn't pull away. Not right away. When he finally let go, the absence felt louder than the touch. The car pulled off, red taillights bleeding into the dark, and I stood there on the curb with my palm burning, my heart pounding, my whole body humming with something I didn't have a name for. I looked down at my hand. The bills were still there, creased and warm. But all I could feel was the place where his thumb had been. I walked toward the house. Hannah opened the door before I reached it, smiling, asking how it went. I told her it was fine. I told her it was nothing. I told her I was tired. And I was. But not in the way she thought. My life has always been orderly. That's what people say when they meet me, when they see the way I keep things. Orderly. Symmetrical. Safe. 16 years of marriage to Hannah. 2 children who look like both of us in equal measure. A mortgage on a house in a neighborhood where every lawn is the same shade of green. I work as a project manager at a mid-sized architectural firm, the kind of place where people wear business casual and celebrate birthdays with sheet cake in the conference room. My days move in patterns I could trace with my eyes closed. Coffee at 6. Commute through traffic that never changes. Meetings about projects that blur together. Home by 6:30 if I'm lucky. Dinner. dishes, homework supervision, bed by 11. Our house sits at the end of a cul-de-sac where everything feels beige, even when it isn't. The homes are variations on the same theme. The conversations at block parties are predictable, and even the weather seems muted somehow, as if the sky itself has agreed to be inoffensive. Hannah fits here perfectly. She always has. She's kind in a way that's dependable, loyal without needing to announce it, efficient in how she manages our lives. She fills silences with updates about our son's soccer games, about our daughter's latest math test, about the neighbor's new fence. I listen. I nod. I participate in the machinery of our life together. But there's a part of me that went dormant somewhere along the way. I can't pinpoint exactly when it happened. Maybe it was gradual, the way a lake freezes from the edges inward. There was a version of me that used to paint, that used to drive out to the cliffs just to watch storms roll in from the ocean. A version that stayed up late reading poetry, that believed art mattered more than paychecks. That person feels like someone I knew once, someone I lost touch with the way you lose touch with college friends who move away. There's a framed photo in the hallway, halfway up the stairs where no one really looks at it anymore. In it, I'm younger, maybe 23, holding a guitar I never learned to play well. My hair is longer. My face is open in a way it isn't now. And in the background, slightly out of focus, there's Elias. He's leaning against a wall, laughing at something outside the frame. You can barely see his face, just the shape of him, the suggestion of who he was to me. Hannah has walked past that photo 1,000 times. She's never asked about him. I think she assumes he was just another college friend, someone who drifted away the way people do. I've let her assume that. I've told myself the same lie so many times it started to feel like the truth. But the reunion unsettled something, cracked something open that I'd sealed shut. I can't sleep anymore. I lie awake while Hannah breathes softly beside me, her back curved away from me in the darkness, and I stare at the ceiling trying to remember what it felt like to be the person in that photograph. The sound of rain against the windows reminds me of Elias's voice, the way it was always low and deliberate, like he'd considered every word before speaking it. The kind of voice that could turn an ordinary comment into something that felt sacred, important, real. And I keep thinking about my hand, about the way he held it in the back seat of that car, about the pressure of his thumb against my wrist, the way it lingered just long enough to be unmistakable. I've replayed that moment so many times it started to feel like something I imagined. But I know it was real. I can still feel it, days later, like a burn that won't fade. During the day, I go through the motions. I sit in meetings and pretend to care about timelines and budgets. I come home and ask my kids about their days. I kiss Hannah on the cheek when she hands me a plate of dinner. I am functional. I am present. But there's a static in my head now, a low hum of something I can't name, and it's getting louder. At night, after everyone else is asleep, I sometimes stand in the garage among the boxes of Christmas decorations and old sports equipment, and I stare at the space where I used to keep my art supplies. I got rid of them years ago. Hannah asked me once why I stopped painting, and I told her I didn't have time anymore. That wasn't true. The truth was that I stopped being able to see anything worth painting. The world had flattened into something manageable, something predictable, and I'd convinced myself that was maturity. But now, standing in the dark garage with the ghost of Elias's touch still on my skin, I realize I've been living like someone afraid to wake up. Like someone who chose safety over truth so long ago that I forgot there was ever a choice at all. I look at my open palm under the dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. The lines there are deeper than they used to be. I'm 41 years old. I have a life that makes sense on paper. I have everything I'm supposed to want. And I have never felt more like I'm disappearing. The message came a week later. I was at my desk at work, staring at a spreadsheet that might as well have been written in another language, when my phone lit up with a notification. A message from a number I didn't have saved, but somehow I knew before I even opened it. I'm back in town for a bit. Thought of you. Coffee. 5 words that shouldn't have meant anything. 5 words that made my hands shake. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. I drafted a response, deleted it, drafted another. I wrote something casual, something that would make it clear this was just 2 old friends catching up. Then I deleted that too. I wrote something honest, something that acknowledged the weight between us. I deleted that faster. Finally, after my coffee had gone cold and my boss had walked past my office twice, I typed the simplest thing I could. Sure. When? His response came almost immediately. Tomorrow. 2 o'clock. That cafe near the river. If it's still there. It was still there. I knew because I'd driven past it 100 times over the years, always meaning to stop in, never quite doing it. I told Hannah I had a meeting with a potential client. The lie came so easily it scared me. The cafe was exactly the kind of place Elias would choose. Quiet, tucked away from the main street, with fogged windows that made the whole world feel softer. I arrived early, sat at a table in the corner, and watched the door like I was waiting for something I couldn't name. When he walked in, brushing rain from his coat, I felt that same tightness in my chest I'd felt outside the bar. Like my body recognized him before my mind could catch up. He looked different in daylight. Older, yes, but also more himself somehow. He'd always had this way of moving through the world like he wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. That hadn't changed. We started cautiously. The kind of conversation you have when you're both testing the boundaries of what you're allowed to say. He asked about work. I asked about his life. He told me he was teaching now, literature at a community college a few hours north. He said he liked it, liked the quiet rhythm of it. I told him about the firm, about the projects we were working on, about the spreadsheets and the meetings. It sounded hollow even as I said it. He told me he'd never married. Said it without bitterness, without apology. Just fact. He talked about restoring old boats on the weekends, about the house he'd bought near the water, about long stretches of solitude that he'd learned to make peace with. I found myself wanting to ask why he'd never found someone, why he'd chosen to be alone, but the question felt too intimate, too revealing. So I didn't ask. Instead, I told him about Hannah, about the kids, about the life I'd built. I made it sound good. I made it sound like enough. He listened the way he always had, with this focused attention that made you feel like every word mattered. And then he asked me something no one else ever asked. Are you happy? The question hung between us like smoke. I opened my mouth to say yes, to give him the same answer I gave everyone else. But the word wouldn't come. Instead, I looked down at my coffee, at the steam rising from it, and said something true for the first time in longer than I could remember. I don't know. He didn't push, didn't ask me to explain. He just nodded, like he understood everything I couldn't say. We sat in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Outside, the rain picked up, blurring the windows even more, and I realized I didn't want to leave. I wanted to stay in this quiet space where I didn't have to pretend to be anything other than what I was. When we finally stood to go, he walked me to my car. The rain had softened to a drizzle, the kind that barely touches you but still makes everything feel damp and close. We stood there in the parking lot, neither of us quite ready to say goodbye. And then Elias did something that felt both careless and deliberate. He placed his hand on my shoulder. Just for a moment. Just long enough for me to feel the weight of it, the warmth of it, through my coat. He said he'd like to do this again. I said I would too. I drove home in complete silence. No radio, no podcasts, nothing to distract me from the feeling spreading through my chest. I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror at a stoplight and barely recognized myself. I looked older than I had that morning, but also more awake. Like something inside me had been sleeping and had just opened its eyes. That night at dinner, Hannah told a story about something that happened at the grocery store. Our daughter laughed, bright and easy. Our son asked for seconds. The kitchen was warm and full of the ordinary sounds of family life. And I sat there feeling like I was watching it all from a great distance. Like I was looking at someone else's life through a window. Hannah asked me if I was okay. I told her I was just tired. She said I'd been saying that a lot lately. I didn't know what to tell her. How do you explain that you're exhausted from holding yourself together? That you've been tired for years, maybe decades, and you're only just now realizing it? After everyone went to bed, I stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes that were already clean, staring out at the backyard where nothing ever changed. I thought about Elias's hand on my shoulder. I thought about the question he'd asked. I thought about the life I'd built and the life I'd buried, and I realized that the distance between them was widening. like a crack in a wall that starts small and then, without you noticing, splits the whole foundation in two. The meetings became routine. That's what we told ourselves. Harmless. Just two old friends reconnecting after years apart. Once a week, sometimes twice. A walk by the river where the path wound through trees that were losing their leaves. A shared lunch at places where no one we knew would see us. A drive through our old university campus, past buildings that looked smaller than they had in our memories. I told Hannah I was meeting a colleague. Then I told her it was a client. Then I stopped explaining altogether, and she stopped asking. I think part of her didn't want to know. Part of her could sense the shift happening, the way you can sense a storm coming before the sky even darkens. Elias had a way of listening that I'd forgotten existed. Most people listen while they're waiting for their turn to talk. Elias listened like he was trying to understand something beneath the words, something you hadn't even said yet. He asked questions that unearthed pieces of my youth I'd buried so deep I'd forgotten they were there. He asked about the paintings I used to make, about the books I used to read, about the version of myself I'd been before I learned to be practical. And slowly, without deciding to, I started painting again. It began small. I bought supplies on my lunch break, told myself it was just to see if I still remembered how. I set up in the garage after everyone went to sleep, working by the dim overhead light, trying to capture things I couldn't name. A landscape from memory, a face half-formed, features I couldn't quite bring into focus. The smell of the paint, the feel of the brush, the way color could say what words couldn't. It all came back like muscle memory. Like my hands remembered, even though my mind had tried to forget. I stored the canvases behind boxes of Christmas decorations, behind old camping gear we never used, behind the accumulated debris of a life I'd been living on autopilot. Hannah never went back there. The garage was my space, she always said. My domain. I never thought I'd be grateful for that distance. But everything was changing. Elias's presence in my life was altering the air around me. I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to in years. The way light moved across a wall in the late afternoon. The hum of the refrigerator in the early morning. The uneven rhythm of my own breathing when I woke up before dawn. Life felt newly, painfully alive. Like someone had turned up the contrast on everything, made all the colors brighter and all the shadows deeper. I started taking different routes to work just to see new things. I started listening to music I hadn't heard since college. I bought a book of poetry and read it in my car during lunch breaks, feeling like a stranger to myself. I felt awake in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying, because I'd forgotten what it cost to actually feel things. I'd forgotten that being numb was easier. One afternoon, Elias and I sat by the river, watching the water move. He was quiet, which wasn't unusual, but there was something different in his silence. Something heavier. Finally, he spoke. You know what I remember most about you? He said. Back then, I mean. Back when we were young. I told him I didn't know. You used to live without pretending, he said. You were the most honest person I'd ever met. You didn't apologize for wanting things. You didn't hide what you felt. I looked at the water, at the way it caught the light. I didn't know what to say to that. Because the person he was describing felt like someone from another life. Someone who died a long time ago. What happened? He asked. His voice was soft, but the question cut through me like glass. I grew up, I said. I got responsible. I did what I was supposed to do. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said something that I still hear in my head when I can't sleep. There's a difference between growing up and disappearing. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about his words. I lay in bed next to Hannah, listening to her breathe, and I felt the weight of every choice I'd made pressing down on me. I thought about the man I'd become, the man who said yes when he meant no, who smiled when he felt nothing, who'd built a life that looked perfect from the outside and felt hollow from within. Hannah stirred, turned toward me in the dark. She reached out, put her hand on my chest the way she used to when we were first married. And I felt nothing. No warmth, no connection, just the simple fact of her hand against my shirt. It wasn't her fault. She hadn't changed. I had. Or maybe I'd finally stopped changing, stopped trying to be what I thought I should be. The guilt was constant now. It lived in my chest like something physical, something I could almost touch. Hannah noticed the paint stains on my sleeve one morning. She smiled, asked if I was making art again. Her voice was bright, hopeful. She said it was good, that I seemed lighter lately. I lied and told her it was just a hobby, just something to keep my hands busy. That night, I dreamed of Elias. We were in a room I didn't recognize, and he was leaning over me, his face close to mine, and he whispered the same thing he'd said by the river. You used to live without pretending. And in the dream, I reached up to touch his face, to close the distance between us, but when I did, I woke up. My heart was hammering. My skin felt too tight. Hannah was still asleep beside me, her face peaceful in the dark, and I felt like a stranger in my own life. Like I'd been playing a role for so long that I'd forgotten it was supposed to be an act. I got out of bed, went downstairs, stood in the dark kitchen staring at nothing. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the clock on the wall. On the fridge, held by magnets, were photos of our family. Birthday parties, vacations, school pictures. A whole archive of a life I'd built. And in every single one, I was smiling. But looking at them now, I could see what I'd been too afraid to admit. That smile wasn't real. It was just another thing I'd learned to perform. I thought about Elias in his house by the water, alone but honest. I thought about the life he'd chosen, the solitude he'd made peace with. And I wondered if he'd ever felt what I was feeling now. This terrible, beautiful ache of finally seeing the truth after spending years in the dark. I picked up my phone, thought about texting him. But what would I say? That I was awake in my own kitchen at 3 in the morning, realizing I'd wasted years of my life. That every time I saw him, I felt more like myself and less like the man I was supposed to be. That I was terrified of what that meant. I put the phone down, stood there in the silence, and for the first time, I let myself think the thought I'd been pushing away for weeks. I was in love with him. I always had been. And everything I'd built, everything I'd become, had been an attempt to bury that truth so deep that I'd never have to face it. But it was too late now. The truth was awake, and I didn't know how to make it go back to sleep. It happened on an evening when the rain came down so hard it felt biblical. I was supposed to meet Elias for coffee, but the weather had other plans. He texted me asking if I wanted to come to his place instead, the cabin he was renting by the lake. He said it casually, like it was nothing, like it didn't change everything. I should have said no. I should have gone home. But I didn't. The drive took 40 minutes through rain so thick my wipers could barely keep up. The roads were empty, the world reduced to headlights and water and the sound of my own breathing. I kept thinking I should turn around. I kept driving forward. The cabin was small, tucked back among trees that leaned over it like they were trying to keep it secret. Warm lights spilled from the windows, and when Elias opened the door, he was holding 2 mugs of tea like he'd been expecting me all along. Like he knew I'd come even when I wasn't sure myself. We sat by the window, watching the storm. He'd built a fire that crackled and hissed, filling the room with heat and the smell of burning wood. We talked for hours. About fear. About loneliness. About the versions of ourselves we'd outlived and the ones we'd never gotten to become. The conversation felt different than all the others. Deeper. More dangerous. I told him things I'd never told anyone. How sometimes I felt invisible in my own house, like I could disappear and no one would notice for days. How I'd stopped dreaming years ago, not just in sleep but in life. How I'd learned to want only what was reasonable and safe. How I'd convinced myself that contentment was the same as happiness, that comfort was the same as peace. Elias listened without interrupting. The firelight moved across his face, making him look younger and older at the same time. When I finally stopped talking, when I'd said everything I could say, he was quiet for a long time. And then he looked at me with something in his eyes I couldn't name. Something that felt like recognition. Like he was seeing all the parts of me I'd tried to hide, and he wasn't afraid of any of them. He reached out. Just once. His hand moved across the small space between us and touched mine where it rested on the arm of the chair. His fingers brushed against my knuckles, so light it could have been an accident. But it wasn't. We both knew it wasn't. The touch held everything we'd both been refusing to name for weeks, maybe for years, maybe for our entire lives. It said, I see you. It said, I know. It said, I've been waiting. I looked down at our hands. at the way his fingers rested against mine, barely touching but somehow containing the whole world. My heart was beating so hard I thought he must be able to hear it. The rain drummed against the roof. The fire popped. Time felt suspended, like we were existing outside of it somehow. And then he leaned forward, slowly, giving me time to pull away, time to stop this before it became real. But I didn't move. I couldn't move. I'd spent so long running from this moment that now that it was here, I was paralyzed. When he kissed me, it wasn't sudden or desperate. It was gentle, careful, like he was afraid I might break. His hand came up to the side of my face, and I felt the warmth of his palm against my jaw, felt the softness of his lips against mine, and something inside me that had been locked for years finally opened. It wasn't just a kiss. It was recognition. It was homecoming. It was every feeling I'd ever tried to bury flooding back all at once, and it was terrifying and perfect and true. For a moment, I kissed him back. For a moment, I let myself feel what I'd been denying. His hand in my hair, his breath against my skin, the way my whole body responded to his like it had been waiting for this, like it had always known this was where I was supposed to be. And then reality crashed back in. I pulled away, not violently, but firmly. I stood up, my hand going to my mouth like I could erase what had just happened. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short gasps. Elias stayed where he was, looking up at me with an expression that held no surprise. Just sadness. Just understanding. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. All I could see was Hannah's face, my children's faces, the life I'd built, the promises I'd made. All I could feel was the weight of what I'd just done pressing down on me like a physical thing. "I'm sorry," I said. My voice came out broken. "I have to go." Elias didn't try to stop me. He just nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. He said my name, softly, like a question, but I was already reaching for my coat, already moving toward the door. The drive home was a blur. Rain pounded the windshield, my hands shook on the wheel, and I could still feel the ghost of his kiss on my lips. I could still feel the truth of it, the rightness of it, and that was worse than anything else. Because it wasn't wrong. That was the problem. It had felt more real than anything I'd felt in years. When I got home, the house was dark except for the kitchen light. I stood in the driveway, my shirt damp with rain, my whole body trembling. Through the window, I could see the refrigerator with its photos, the table where we ate dinner every night, the evidence of the life I'd chosen. I went inside quietly, hoping everyone was asleep. But when I walked into the kitchen, I stopped. Because there, on the table, was one of my paintings. The one I'd done of a face half-formed, features blurred. Hannah must have found it in the garage. She must have brought it inside. I stood there staring at it, at this piece of evidence, and I felt something crack open in my chest. I sank into a chair, put my head in my hands, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself cry. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, steady tears that came from some deep place I'd sealed off years ago. I cried for the life I'd built and the life I'd buried. I cried for the man I'd become and the man I used to be. I cried for Elias, for Hannah, for my children, for everyone who would be hurt by the truth I could no longer deny. Because the kiss hadn't changed anything. It had only revealed what had always been there. And now I had to decide what to do with that truth. I didn't contact Elias for days. Then days became a week. Then more. I deleted his messages without reading them. I threw myself into work with a desperation that must have been obvious to everyone around me. I stayed late at the office, volunteered for projects no one else wanted, did anything I could to avoid going home, to avoid the quiet moments where the truth would find me again. I tried to rebuild the illusion. I tried to go back to the person I'd been before the reunion, before the cafe, before that night in the cabin. I kissed Hannah goodnight. I asked my kids about their days. I mowed the lawn. I fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom. I did all the things a good husband and father does, and I did them with a kind of frantic energy, like if I just performed well enough, I could make it real again. But the distance between who I was and who I was pretending to be had become unbearable. It was like walking around with a wound that wouldn't close, that kept bleeding no matter how hard I pressed against it. Every time I looked at Hannah, I saw the lie. Every time I kissed her, I felt the absence of what I'd felt with Elias. Every time I smiled at my children, I wondered what it would do to them when they learned their father had been living a fiction. Hannah knew something was wrong. She had to know. She'd started watching me differently, with this careful attention that felt like she was trying to solve a puzzle. She asked me questions that I deflected. She reached for me in bed, and I pretended to be asleep. I could feel her pulling away too, protecting herself from whatever storm she could sense coming. One night, she found me sitting on the porch long after midnight. I hadn't meant to be there. I just walked outside and kept walking until I was sitting on the steps, staring at nothing, my mind turning over the same impossible questions. How do you leave a life you've built? How do you hurt people you love? How do you choose between the truth and their happiness? She came out wrapped in a robe, her feet bare against the cold wood. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside me, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. We sat in silence for a long time, the neighborhood dark and sleeping around us. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, careful. Are you happy? The same question Elias had asked. The same question I'd been running from. I didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The silence stretched between us like something alive, something that hurt to touch. She tried again. Is it someone else? I thought about lying. The lie was right there, easy and familiar. But I was so tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of performing. Tired of being someone I wasn't. It's not that simple, I said. She nodded, like she'd expected that answer. Like she'd known for a while. Are you going to leave? Her voice cracked on the last word, and I felt something break inside my chest. Because this was Hannah. Kind, loyal, dependable Hannah, who'd built a life with me, who'd never asked me to be anything other than what I appeared to be. Who didn't deserve this? Who didn't deserve any of this? I don't know, I said. And it was the truest thing I'd said to her in years. She didn't cry. She just sat there beside me, staring out at the street, at the houses where other families were sleeping, where other people had simpler problems. Finally, she stood up. She put her hand on my shoulder for just a moment, the same way Elias had that day in the parking lot. Then she went back inside, leaving me alone with the night and the truth I could no longer avoid. The next day, I drove to the lake. I didn't plan it. I just got in my car and started driving, and before I knew it, I was on the road to Elias's cabin. I didn't know if he'd be there. I didn't know what I'd say if he was. I just knew I couldn't keep running. He was standing on the dock when I arrived, looking out at the water. He must have heard my car, but he didn't turn around. I walked down to where he stood, my feet heavy on the wooden planks, and stopped beside him. We didn't speak for a long time, just stood there watching the water, the way it moved in the wind, the way the light caught on its surface. The silence felt different than it had before, heavier, more final. I don't know how to live with what I feel, I said. My voice came out rough, like I hadn't used it in days. He looked at me then. His eyes were sad, but there was something else there too. Something that looked like understanding, like acceptance. Then maybe start by not hiding it, he said. It sounded so simple, so impossible. I thought about my children, about the moment I'd have to tell them, about Hannah's face when I finally said the words out loud, about the life I'd spent 16 years building, about to crumble because I'd finally admitted the truth. But I also thought about the man I'd been before I learned to lie, about the paintings hidden in my garage, about the version of myself that had disappeared, piece by piece, year by year, until I'd become a stranger to my own life. What if I lose everything? I asked. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. What if you've already lost it? What if you lost it years ago, and you've just been pretending you didn't? The words hit me like a physical blow. Because he was right. I had lost it. I'd lost myself the moment I decided safety was more important than truth. The moment I chose a life that looked right over one that felt real. I felt tears on my face before I realized I was crying. Not the quiet tears from that night in my kitchen. These were different. Heavier. They came from somewhere deeper, somewhere I'd kept locked for so long I'd forgotten it existed. Elias didn't touch me. Didn't try to comfort me. He just stood there beside me while I broke apart. While I finally let myself feel the weight of every choice I'd made. Every year I'd wasted being someone I wasn't. When I could finally breathe again, When the tears had slowed, I looked at him. I don't know what comes next, I said. He nodded. That's okay. You don't have to know yet. We stood there until the sun began to set, painting the water in shades of orange and gold. And for the first time since the reunion, since that moment in the back seat of the car when his thumb pressed against my wrist, I felt something that wasn't quite peace, but wasn't panic either. I felt clarity. The truth was going to hurt people I loved. The truth was going to break things that couldn't be fixed. But the truth was also the only way forward. The only way to stop disappearing. The only way to finally, after all these years, start living like myself again. The house looks different now. Half empty. Boxes line the hallway where family photos used to hang. The walls have pale rectangles where frames once were, ghosts of the life we built. Hannah moves through the rooms carefully, deliberately, like she's navigating around something fragile. Maybe she is. Maybe we both are. There were no fights. No scenes. Just exhaustion and a kind of sad respect. We told the children together, sitting at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals. Their faces went through all the stages I expected: confusion, hurt, anger, silence. Our daughter cried. Our son didn't. He just looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time, trying to reconcile the father he knew with this stranger admitting he'd been living a lie. I don't know if they'll forgive me. I don't know if I deserve their forgiveness. All I can do is be honest now, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. Hannah signed the papers without ceremony. She didn't ask me to stay. Didn't ask me to try harder. I think she knew, maybe long before I did, that I'd already left. That I'd left years ago, and my body had just been going through the motions. The apartment I rent is small, just 2 rooms near the river. The furniture is minimal, temporary. It doesn't feel like home yet. Maybe it never will. But there's a window that faces east, and in the mornings, light comes through in a way that makes me want to paint. I've set up an easel in the corner. No more hiding canvases behind Christmas decorations. No more pretending I don't need this. Some nights, I walk along the riverbank, past the cafe where it all began. The windows still fog up the same way. Sometimes I go in, order coffee, sit at the same table. I don't always see Elias. We haven't made promises to each other. Haven't defined what this is. Maybe we never will. Maybe that's not what this is about. But sometimes he's there. And when he is, we sit together in comfortable silence, or we talk about small things, or we just exist in the same space without needing it to be anything more than what it is. There's no pressure, no expectations, just 2 people who finally stopped hiding. Last week, he came to the apartment, brought wine and takeout. We ate sitting on the floor because I only have 1 chair. He looked at the paintings leaning against the wall, all the work I've done in the last few weeks. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he pointed to one, a landscape of the lake at sunset. This one, he said. This is you. I asked him what he meant. He said it looked like someone remembering how to see. On my small table by the window, there's a sketch I finished yesterday. 2 hands touching, fingers intertwined, one pulling away and one holding on. I'm not sure which hand is which. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe they're both mine, the part that's still afraid and the part that's learning not to be. The children visit sometimes. Awkward dinners where we're all trying to figure out our new shapes. My daughter asked about Elias last week. I told her the truth, that he's someone who reminds me of who I used to be. She didn't say anything after that, but she didn't leave either. I don't know what the future looks like. I don't know if I'll ever stop feeling guilty for the pain I've caused. I don't know if honest living erases years of dishonest sleep. But I know that when I wake up now, I recognize the person in the mirror, and that has to count for something. Outside, the city hums with its evening sounds, car horns and distant voices, and the rhythm of people moving through their lives. I stand at my window, looking out at the river, at the lights reflecting on the water, at the world that somehow feels both smaller and larger than it did before. I close my eyes, breathe in the cold air from the crack in the window. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, I don't feel the need to explain myself to anyone. The truth doesn't make you free, not the way people say it does. It just makes you honest. And sometimes, if you're lucky, that's enough.